I never thought he'd find me. Not here. Not like this. Not when my body was being torn apart from the inside out. When I was completely stripped of my armor, vulnerable in ways I'd spent 2 years ensuring he'd never witness again. But as the contraction ripped through my lower abdomen with the force of a physical fist, bending my body in half and stealing the air from my lungs, I heard them before I felt the shift in the room's energy. The nurses gasping, the frantic whispers, the sudden scurrying of feet that suggested something momentous had just occurred in this sterile, fluorescent-lit space where I'd been promised anonymity and safety. The delivery room doors burst open with the kind of violence that doesn't belong in a place dedicated to birth. And there he was, standing in the doorway like a prophecy I'd spent 24 months trying desperately to outrun. Dante Moretti, the man I'd fled from in the dead of night. The man whose name alone could make my entire body respond with a symphony of contradictions. Fear and longing, rage and desire, the absolute certainty that my carefully constructed life of lies and false identities was about to crumble like something that had never been solid to begin with. His eyes found mine across the distance of the hospital room, a distance that suddenly felt impossibly small, as if the space between us was compressed into nothing at all. And in that single, crystallized moment of recognition, I realized with the kind of clarity that only comes when your defenses are completely obliterated that everything I had done, every sacrifice I had made, every night I'd lain awake in my small apartment listening to every sound in the hallway and wondering if that was finally him coming for me, had been utterly and devastatingly pointless. He had found me. Of course he had found me. Men like Dante Moretti didn't just let things go. They hunted them down with the kind of patience and certainty that came from a lifetime of getting exactly what they wanted. And I had been foolish enough to believe that my desperation and my distance could somehow make me an exception to that rule. "Get out!" I gasped between contractions, my voice barely recognizable as my own, raw and strained and shaking with a cocktail of emotions so complex that I couldn't untangle them, even if I'd tried. Which I absolutely didn't have the mental or physical capacity to do, while my uterus was quite literally attempting to expel another human being from my body. You cannot be in here right now, I don't." But the words dissolved into a cry, as another wave of pain crashed through me. And I gripped the hospital bed's railing so hard my knuckles turned white. My entire form convulsing, as my body did what it had been designed to do, regardless of my emotional state, or the fact that the father of my child was now standing in the corner of the room, being confronted by a security guard who looked simultaneously terrified and uncertain about whether he should actually be threatening someone who carried the kind of absolute authority that radiated off Dante like heat from a burning building. "It's fine," Dante said, his voice that familiar smooth darkness that I remembered from countless nights, a voice that had whispered promises and threats in equal measure against my skin, while his hands moved across my body with the kind of ownership that both thrilled and terrified me in ways I'd never fully explained to anyone. "I have clearance. Everyone here is aware of my presence." He said this with the absolute certainty of someone who had made a single phone call and reorganized the entire operational structure of a metropolitan hospital. And I realized with a sinking feeling that dropped deeper than the pain in my abdomen that he was right. The security guard's expression had shifted from defensive to deferential in the space of a single sentence, and the nurses who had been bustling around moments before suddenly seemed very focused on checking equipment and avoiding eye contact with either of us. "How did you—" I started, but another contraction seized my body, and I was forced to abandon language entirely, reduced instead to the most primal sounds that a human body can make. Sounds that belonged to the animal part of me that had been trying to survive without him for the past 2 years. Sounds that he was now hearing for the first time. Sounds that should have remained private and sacred and utterly untouched by his presence or his knowledge or his absolute certainty, that he could simply materialize in my life whenever and wherever he chose, consequences and my feelings about it be damned. When the pain receded just enough for me to breathe again, I looked at him properly, and the impact of seeing him in person after so long Months of thinking I'd made a clean escape. Months of attempting to convince myself that what we'd had was an addiction I'd successfully broken. Hit me like a physical blow that was somehow worse than the labor pains, because at least the labor pains served a purpose. It was producing something beautiful and necessary. Whereas the pain of seeing him standing there in a tailored black suit, his dark hair pulled back from a face that was carved from marble and arrogance and absolute certainty, was purely destructive. Purely about reminding me of everything I'd lost by running, everything I'd been unable to forget despite my desperate attempts to bury it under a new identity and a new life and a careful, meticulous distance. "How long?" he asked, stepping further into the room with the casual ownership of someone who had never questioned whether he had the right to be anywhere he wanted to be. And there was something in his voice, some underlying current of emotion that he was desperately attempting to contain, that made me realize this wasn't just about reclaiming me or punishing me for disappearing, or even about the violation of being lied to about something so monumentally significant that it had fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of my life, and apparently, his as well. "How long have you been pregnant?" he continued, his eyes moving from my face to my swollen belly, with the kind of intensity that suggested he was trying to calculate something, to determine the exact moment that his child had been conceived, and how I'd managed to hide this from him. How I'd managed to hide anything from him, given that he apparently had the resources to track my movements across 2 years and 2 states, and several carefully constructed false identities. "Go to hell," I spat at him, though the effect was somewhat diminished by the fact that I was mid-labor, and my voice came out shaky and desperate. And he simply stood there watching me with those dark eyes that had once looked at me with something approximating tenderness before the realities of his world and my own cowardice had driven us apart. "You have no right to be here. You have no right to know anything about this pregnancy or this baby or anything else in my life, and I want you to leave right now before I have security actually do their job and remove you from this room." I knew even as I said it that I was powerless, that security would do whatever he wanted them to do, that I had absolutely no leverage in this situation, and the fury that rose up in me at my own helplessness was almost as overwhelming as the physical pain of my contracting uterus. But he didn't leave. Of course he didn't leave. Instead, he pulled a chair from the corner of the room and sat down directly in my line of sight, making it impossible for me to avoid looking at him even if I'd wanted to. And the casual way he settled into that chair, one leg crossed over the other, his expression completely unreadable but his dark eyes tracking every movement I made, was somehow more threatening than any explicit threat could have been, because it suggested that he had absolutely no intention of going anywhere, that he was prepared to sit through the entirety of my labor and delivery, that he had reorganized his entire life to be in this exact position at this exact moment. "I'm not going anywhere, Bella," he said, his voice dropping into that register that used to make my entire body respond like an instrument being played by a master musician. And I hated that even now, even here, even in the midst of the most vulnerable moment of my life, my body still recognized him, still responded to the particular cadence of his voice, and the way he said that Italian term of endearment that had once meant something completely different, but now felt like a threat wrapped in velvet. "You can be as angry as you want to be. You can scream and rage and tell me to leave 1,000 times. But I'm not going anywhere until I've seen my child, until I've looked into their eyes and known that they're real, that you actually carried our baby for 9 months, and never once thought to tell me, never once considered that I might want to know, that I might have rights here that supersede whatever fantasies you've constructed about disappearing and starting over and building some kind of life without me." Another contraction seized me, and I surrendered to it completely, my entire body seized by pain so intense that it briefly eclipsed even the profound horror of his presence, the absolute violation of having the most private moment of my life witnessed by the one person on earth that I'd been desperately trying to escape. And when it finally released me, gasping and trembling, he was still there, still watching, still waiting, and I understood in that moment that my daughter, our daughter, the word still tasting strange and impossible on my tongue, was about to enter the world to a father who had found her before she even took her first breath. And there was absolutely nothing I could do to prevent that. No amount of running or lying or reinvention that would be strong enough to keep him out now that he knew. "The doctors need to examine you," one of the nurses said softly, and I realized that she'd been waiting for my contraction to pass, that everyone in the room was pretending not to notice the absolute emotional devastation unfolding before them, that we were all engaged in a collective pretense that this was somehow a normal delivery, that there wasn't a dangerously powerful man sitting in the corner of the room, rewriting the future with his mere presence. "We need to check your dilation," the nurse continued, her professional composure intact even though I could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands shook just slightly as she prepared to examine me while he watched, while he learned intimate details about my body and my medical status and everything else that should have remained private and sacred. And as she checked me, as I felt the violation of being examined while he watched from his chair, I finally understood. Not intellectually, but with my entire being, in the depths of the part of me that had always known the truth despite my desperate attempts to deny it, that I had never really escaped him at all. I had only been in a 2-year holding pattern, suspended in a false sense of safety, and now the real reckoning was about to begin. Before the doors burst open and my entire world collapsed into itself, like a house of cards built on the fragile foundation of lies and desperation and the kind of hope that only comes when you're running for your life. There were 2 years of running, 2 years of looking over my shoulder every single time I heard footsteps that sounded remotely like his. 2 years of jumping at the sound of my phone ringing in the darkness of my apartment. 2 years of loving a man I couldn't have and fearing with every fiber of my being the moment that he would inevitably find what I had hidden from him, what I had been protecting with every ounce of strength and sacrifice and maternal instinct that had bloomed inside me like something wild and impossible and absolutely non-negotiable. The memory of how it all began crashes into me between contractions, uninvited and devastatingly vivid despite my desperate attempts over these past 2 years to sand down the sharp edges of those moments, to convince myself that what I felt for him was simply an addiction I had successfully overcome through distance and time and the careful construction of a new identity. But lying in this hospital bed with his presence burning through the room like a brand on my skin, I couldn't maintain the lie anymore, couldn't pretend that what we had was anything other than the most consuming, all-encompassing, absolutely catastrophic love affair of my entire existence. It started on a night that felt completely ordinary until the moment everything changed. I was working as a bartender at an upscale restaurant in the downtown financial district, the kind of place where powerful men came to conduct business and display their wealth and power like peacocks spreading their feathers. And I was good at my job in the way that beautiful women in their 20s often are. Attentive and charming and careful never to make the customers uncomfortable, always knowing exactly when to smile and when to disappear, how to be present without being intrusive, how to navigate the delicate balance between professional and inviting that kept the tips flowing and the customers returning week after week. On that particular night, a group of men had occupied the corner booth for hours, drinking expensive whiskey and conducting conversations that seemed to operate on some frequency I wasn't quite equipped to understand. And then he walked in. And I say walked in. But what he actually did was simply materialize, as if the universe had reorganized itself to make space for his arrival, as if the air itself had been holding its breath waiting for him to enter it. Dante Moretti was the kind of beautiful that felt dangerous, the kind of striking that made your body respond before your mind had processed what you were actually looking at. Dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets and threats in equal measure, sharp cheekbones and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from obsidian, and a presence that filled the entire restaurant the moment he stepped through the doors, sucking all the oxygen out of the room and leaving everyone else diminished in the shadow of his existence. I remember thinking, in that first moment of seeing him, that he was the most terrifying and most compelling thing I had ever laid eyes on, And I remember also thinking that I should stay far, far away from him, that whatever he was, whoever he was, couldn't possibly be good for someone like me who was just trying to build a quiet, unremarkable life and avoid the kind of drama that my mother had always seemed to attract like a magnet. The kind of complicated, dangerous men who left nothing but heartbreak and emptiness in their wake. But of course I didn't stay away from him, because that's the thing about men like Dante, about predators dressed in Valentino and confidence and the absolute certainty that everyone around them exists for their pleasure and convenience. They don't give you the option of staying away. They simply decide that they want you, and then they make it happen. They orchestrate the circumstances of your life so carefully that it feels like fate, like destiny, like something that was always meant to be rather than something that was calculated and executed with the precision of someone who has spent his entire life getting exactly what he wanted. He ordered a drink from me personally, which shouldn't have meant anything except for the way he did it, with that intense, dark stare that made me feel like I was the only person in the restaurant, like I was the only thing that mattered, like he was seeing something in me that nobody else had ever bothered to look for. And when I brought him his whiskey, he caught my wrist gently but with undeniable firmness and asked me my name. And when I told him, he repeated it back to me like it was the most beautiful word he'd ever heard, like it held some kind of meaning that transcended the simple syllables and consonants of my actual name. "Come back at midnight when your shift ends," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact, as if he had already decided what the evening would look like and was simply informing me of his decision. And I should have said no. I should have pulled my wrist away and walked back to the bar and made a firm decision to never engage with him again. But instead I found myself nodding, my body betraying my rational mind, my physical form responding to the command in his voice in ways I didn't quite understand. At midnight, I met him in the parking garage behind the restaurant, which seems insane now, the kind of reckless decision that only a 24-year-old with incomplete emotional development could possibly make. And he took me to a hotel penthouse that overlooked the entire city, a space that was all glass and steel and minimalist elegance. And for the first time in my entire life, someone looked at me like I was the most important thing they had ever possessed. Like my body and my mind and my heart were things worth exploring with meticulous attention and absolute devotion. That night, he made love to me with an intensity that felt like he was trying to memorize every single part of me, trying to brand me with his touch so completely that I would never be able to separate my own body from the sensation of his hands on my skin. And somewhere between the pleasure and the pain and the complete dissolution of my sense of self, I fell in love with him in a way that felt not like a choice, but like an inevitability, like something that had been written into my DNA the moment I was born. What followed was 3 months of absolute intoxication, secret meetings in hotel rooms and empty restaurants after closing, phone calls in the middle of the night where he would tell me things he claimed he had never told anyone else, the gradual revelation of what his world actually was, the careful, incremental way he introduced me to the reality of Dante Moretti beyond the beautiful exterior and the charming veneer. I learned that he was involved in things that existed in the shadows, things that required a certain amount of violence and ruthlessness and moral flexibility. And I learned this not through explicit confession, but through the sudden appearance of armed men around him, through the way conversations would stop the moment I entered a room, through the careful way he began to separate the part of his life that involved me from the part that involved his empire and his business, and the absolute power he wielded in a world that operated by rules I didn't fully understand. The realization that I was pregnant came on a Tuesday morning, and I remember sitting on the bathroom floor of my apartment with the positive test in my shaking hands. And in that moment, with absolute crystalline clarity, I understood that I had made a catastrophic mistake, that I had allowed myself to become entangled with someone whose world would inevitably consume me and anyone who depended on me, and that the only ethical choice I could possibly make was to disappear completely and irrevocably, to ensure that my child would never have to grow up in the shadow of his father's darkness, that my baby would never have to wonder if the men around them were genuine or if they were merely extensions of a criminal empire, that my daughter would have the kind of normal, uncomplicated childhood that I never had, and that Dante's world could never possibly provide. So I left him while he was sleeping in his penthouse, leaving behind a note that said nothing except, "I'm sorry." And I spent the next 2 years meticulously constructing a new life, moving to a different state, changing my name legally, working under the table at various jobs that didn't require background checks, attending prenatal appointments under an assumed name, and building an existence so carefully hidden that I truly believed, with the kind of desperate hope that only a frightened pregnant woman could muster, that he would never find me, that the distance and my deception and the apparent insignificance of a woman who had once been his plaything would be enough to keep him out of our lives forever. But I had underestimated the absolute scope of his reach, and the fact that love, or possession, or obsession, I still couldn't quite differentiate between the three, was a motivation that transcended his usual calculations and his ability to let things go and move on to the next conquest, the next pleasure, the next beautiful woman who could fill the void that I had left behind when I ran. During those 2 years, there were nights when I swore I could feel him, when I would wake up gasping from dreams where his hands were on me, where he was calling my name into the darkness, and I would lie awake in the cheap apartment I'd rented using cash, my hand on my swollen belly, talking to my unborn daughter and making promises that I would keep her safe, that I would never let him find us, that our lives would be simple and uncomplicated and completely divorced from the chaos and danger that seemed to orbit around him like a gravitational field that pulled everything into his sphere and transformed it into something dark and powerful and utterly beyond anyone's control. Every man I met after I left him was compared to him, unconsciously and devastatingly. And every single time, they fell short in ways that made me realize I hadn't actually escaped him at all, that what I had done was simply create the illusion of escape, while the reality of my love for him continued to exist beneath every decision I made, every breath I took, every moment of peace that I managed to construct in my small, isolated world. I tried to convince myself during therapy sessions, which I attended regularly under yet another false name, that what I felt for him was simply the residual effects of emotional trauma and physical chemistry, that given enough time and distance, these feelings would fade and become bearable, that I would eventually be able to remember him without my entire body responding like it was being called home to a place it had never actually belonged. But none of that mattered now, because he was here, sitting in the corner of my hospital room, watching me give birth to his child. And everything I had sacrificed, and everything I had run from, and everything I had tried desperately to protect, had been obliterated in a single moment of his entrance. And I understood with the kind of devastating certainty that only comes at the moment of absolute reckoning that the 2 years I had spent believing I was safe, believing I had successfully escaped, believing that I could raise our daughter without him ever knowing she existed, had been nothing more than a brief intermission in the story that had been written the moment he decided that I belonged to him. And now the real tragedy was about to unfold. As another contraction seized my body and pulled me back into the present moment, I felt him watching me, and I realized with a sinking feeling that there was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide, and that the daughter I had been trying to protect from him was about to meet her father at the moment of her very first breath. And I had absolutely no idea what that would mean for either of us. But I suspected, with every maternal instinct screaming inside me, that everything I had feared about his world was about to become her world too. The pain that erupted through my body as the contractions intensified seemed almost trivial compared to the emotional agony of watching Dante sit motionless in that chair, his dark eyes never wavering from my face, cataloging every expression, every moment of weakness, every desperate attempt I made to maintain some semblance of composure while my body was being systematically torn apart in service of bringing our daughter into a world that he would inevitably claim ownership over. And I realized, with a kind of sick understanding that came from somewhere deep in my maternal instinct, that by choosing to run, by deciding unilaterally that he didn't deserve to know about this pregnancy, I had set in motion a series of events that would culminate in this exact moment, with him sitting there like a judge at the gates of hell, waiting to witness the birth of his child while I was completely defenseless to stop him. "How long?" he asked again, his voice cutting through the hum of the fetal monitor and the quiet, professional murmurings of the nurses who were trying very hard to pretend that the most dangerous man in the city wasn't sitting in the corner of a hospital delivery room, completely disrupting the careful, clinical atmosphere that was supposed to allow me to focus on the monumental task of pushing a human being out of my body. "I need to know exactly how long you've known about this pregnancy," he continued, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees in a posture that suggested casual interest, but his eyes conveyed something far more sinister. The look of someone who was mentally calculating timelines and implications, and the precise moment at which I had made the decision to hide something this monumentally significant from him. "Because I'm trying to understand how you managed to keep this from me for this long. And the only way that makes sense is if you got pregnant immediately after you left. If you orchestrated your escape knowing that you were carrying my child. If this entire elaborate disappearing act was premeditated with the full knowledge that you were protecting something that belonged to me." The word "belonged" hung in the air like a weapon, and I felt my entire body respond with a visceral rejection of the concept, even as another contraction seized me and forced me to abandon language entirely. Forced me to surrender to the physical reality of labor that transcended arguments about ownership and autonomy, and the fundamental question of who had the right to make decisions about another human being's life. When the contraction finally released me, gasping and trembling and soaked in sweat despite the hospital gown that clung to my skin, I looked at him with every ounce of defiance I could muster, even though we both knew that I was in no position to defy anything, that my vulnerability was absolute and complete, and that he was fully aware of that fact. "She's mine," I said, my voice raw and desperate but unmistakably fierce, and I felt something shift in his expression at the word "she," the confirmation that our child was a daughter seeming to land like a physical blow against his chest. "This baby is my daughter, and I made the decision to carry her, to birth her, to raise her, and you don't get to claim ownership over her, or over me, or over any part of this experience. And frankly, I don't care how you managed to find me. I don't care what resources you had to deploy to track me down. But you need to understand that your presence here doesn't change anything about the fact that I was trying to protect her from you, and everything that you represent." The words poured out of me with the kind of desperate intensity that only comes when you're fighting a battle you know you've already lost. When you're making a stand that you understand is completely futile, but that you need to make anyway, just for the sake of your own dignity, and your own sense of having fought back against the absolute annihilation of your autonomy. He didn't respond to my declaration with anger, which somehow made it worse, because if he had yelled at me or threatened me or even simply retaliated against my defiance, it would have fit into the narrative I had constructed about him being a villain, a danger, a man whose darkness was so absolute that my decision to run from him was not only justified, but heroic in its own way. Instead, he simply watched me with an expression that shifted between something that looked disturbingly like hurt and something that looked disturbingly like love, and that combination of emotions on his face was infinitely more dangerous than any threat he could have made, because it suggested that his feelings for me were genuine, that his rage at being lied to was rooted in something authentic and devastating, rather than simply the wounded pride of a man who didn't like being defied. "You think you were protecting her from me?" he said, his voice dropping into a register so low that I had to strain to hear it, despite the fact that we were the only two people having this conversation, despite the fact that the nurses had positioned themselves far enough away to give us at least the illusion of privacy. "But what you were actually doing was deciding, completely unilaterally and without any input from me, that I was too dangerous to know about my own child, that I was so fundamentally corrupted by the world I operate in that my own daughter would be better off never knowing me, never even knowing that I existed, growing up in poverty and fear, and the kind of isolation that you've been subjecting yourself to for the past 2 years because you couldn't bear the thought of being connected to me anymore." He paused, and in that pause I could see him struggling with something, struggling with the tension between his need to maintain control and his desperate desire to make me understand something that he clearly believed was essential. But the truth is, Bella, the truth that you've never wanted to acknowledge, is that I would have moved mountains to keep you safe, that I would have restructured my entire empire to accommodate a child, that my darkness, as you call it, has never extended to you or anyone that you love because that's not how my world works. My world protects what's mine with absolute ferocity, and that's something you should have understood before you decided to run. The nurse approached me as another contraction began to build, her expression professionally sympathetic even though I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was hyper-aware of his presence, and I gripped the bed railings as the pain intensified, my entire body convulsing as my cervix completed its dilation, and the moment finally arrived, the moment that every contraction had been building toward, the moment that would make everything real in a way that abstract discussions about his empire and my fear and the fundamental incompatibility of our worlds could never quite accomplish. "You're fully dilated," the nurse said. "We're ready to start pushing whenever you feel the next contraction begin." And I nodded, my entire being focused on the singular task of bringing my daughter into the world, on the act of pushing her out of the safety of my body and into a world where Dante Moretti was waiting to meet her, where he would look into her eyes for the first time and make decisions about her future that I had desperately hoped to make alone. The first push felt like my entire body was being reorganized from the inside out, like my skeleton was being reconstructed while I was still conscious enough to feel every moment of it. And I remember hearing Dante move from his chair. I remember the shock of realizing that he was standing now, that he was moving closer, that he was positioning himself so that he could see what was happening, could witness the moment that his daughter entered the world, and that violated privacy in ways that transcended the physical exposure of childbirth, that felt like a violation of something sacred and intimate that should have belonged only to me. "Don't look," I said, gasping between pushes, my voice desperate and entirely ineffectual because he was going to do whatever he wanted to do regardless of my objections, because his need to witness this moment superseded any desire he might have had to respect my boundaries or my modesty or my desperate wish that this most vulnerable moment of my life could remain private and untainted by his presence. But he was there. And with each push, my daughter moved closer to the threshold between my body and the external world, closer to the moment where she would become a separate person that Dante could touch and hold and claim as his own. And I felt the panicked urgency that comes from understanding that you're about to lose something that has belonged exclusively to you for 9 months, that you're about to share her with someone who had the power and the resources to take her away from you completely if he decided that's what he wanted to do. The pain of childbirth transcended physical sensation at that point. It became existential. It became psychological. It became the agony of surrendering control over the one thing in my life that I had managed to keep completely under my dominion. And as my daughter's head crowned and I felt the burning, tearing sensation of her emergence, I wanted to scream at him to leave, wanted to demand that he turn around, wanted to do something, anything to prevent him from witnessing this moment, but I couldn't. Because my body was no longer mine to control. It was responding to the imperative of birth in ways that transcended my conscious will. "She's here," the nurse said with excitement in her voice. "The head is out. One more push should do it." And I gathered every remaining ounce of strength and pushed with the kind of ferocity that comes from knowing that you're running out of time. That once my daughter emerged into the world, she would no longer be exclusively mine. That she would become something that was equally his, and with one final push that felt like it was ripping me apart from the inside out, she emerged into the world in a rush of fluid and blood, and the kind of raw biological reality that transcends any romantic notions about childbirth being a miracle or a beautiful moment. It was violent and primal and absolutely devastating. The nurses immediately began the process of cleaning her, and I caught my first glimpse of her tiny purple-red face as she drew in her first breath and let out a cry that sounded like the universe announcing her arrival, like the world reorganizing itself to make space for her existence. And in that moment, As I watched my daughter take her first breath outside of my body, I looked toward where Dante was standing and saw his entire expression transformed into something I had never seen before, something that looked like profound, overwhelming, absolutely all-consuming love. And I understood with a clarity that was almost blinding that in that single moment, when my daughter entered the world and her father witnessed her first cry, everything that I had tried to protect her from by running became completely and utterly irrelevant, because the connection between them had been forged in that instant, and there was no distance, no deception, no elaborate escape plan that could ever sever that bond. The nurse placed my daughter on my chest, and I felt the weight of her, the reality of her, the absolute certainty that my life would never be uncomplicated again. And then Dante was there, his hand touching her tiny, wet head with a gentleness that completely contradicted everything that I knew about who he was. And he looked at me with an expression that contained something approximating tenderness, mixed with something that looked disturbingly like possession. And in that moment, cradling our newborn daughter between us, I realized with devastating finality that my escape had never been real, that my 2 years of running had only been a prologue to this moment, and that the true reckoning, the moment where I would have to confront the reality of choosing between my freedom and my love for both of them, was only just beginning. 3 days had passed since my daughter entered the world in a blur of pain and blood and the kind of primal desperation that comes from knowing that you're about to lose complete control over the trajectory of your own life. And in those 3 days, I had discovered that Dante Moretti's presence in the delivery room had been merely the opening move in a much more elaborate and devastating chess game that he had been playing with meticulous precision, reorganizing every single aspect of my hospital stay, and by extension my future, with the kind of absolute authority that suggested that my objections and my desperate pleas for autonomy were nothing more than background noise to be tolerated, but ultimately ignored. He had made calls. I could see him in the corner of my hospital room with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and measured as he spoke in Italian to people whose names I would never know, and whose jobs apparently involved ensuring that every doctor, every nurse, every single person with any authority in this hospital was aware that Dante Moretti had claimed stake in my medical care and my child's welfare, and the shift in how I was treated became noticeable within hours of his arrival. Suddenly, my nurses were more attentive. My pain medication was adjusted before I even asked for it, and the hospital administrator herself had appeared in my room to assure me that they would be providing me with premium accommodations and the very best care available. The irony wasn't lost on me, that his control, his power, his absolute dominion over every situation was actually resulting in objectively better medical treatment, was actually ensuring that I received excellent care and that my daughter was being monitored by some of the finest pediatricians in the city. And yet every single improvement in my circumstances felt like another chain being wrapped around my wrists, another way that he was demonstrating his ability to reorganize reality according to his will. Another reminder that I had absolutely no leverage in this situation, that my wishes and my autonomy and my desperate desire for independence were irrelevant in the face of his resources and his connections, and his absolute certainty that he had the right to make decisions about both of our lives. When the nurses brought my daughter to me for feeding, I watched Dante observe the process with an intensity that was almost clinical in its focus, his eyes tracking every movement she made, every time she latched onto me, every expression that flickered across her tiny face. And I realized that he was studying her the way a businessman might study a contract or an investment, trying to understand her completely, trying to memorize every detail of her existence so that he could claim complete knowledge of her, could position himself as her protector and her authority figure before she even had the consciousness to resist him. "I've arranged for a private neonatal team to monitor her at home," he said on the second day, making the announcement while I was in the middle of changing her diaper, his voice carrying that particular tone of certainty that suggested this wasn't a proposal or a request for my input, but rather a statement of fact that had already been decided and was now simply being communicated to me for my information. She'll have 24-hour care, the best specialists available, and I've also arranged for your recovery to be overseen by a private physician who will visit the penthouse daily to ensure that you're healing properly and that there are no complications that go unnoticed. The casual way he said, the penthouse, as if it was already understood that this was where we would be going, as if my small apartment in a different state had already been erased from consideration, made my entire body go rigid with a rage so profound that it transcended simple anger. It was the rage of someone who was watching their autonomy be systematically dismantled piece by piece and was completely powerless to stop it. "You're not taking us anywhere," I said, my voice shaking despite my attempts to keep it steady, despite the fact that my body was still raw and bleeding and incapable of any kind of physical resistance. "I'm going back to my apartment, I'm raising my daughter on my own, and you need to accept that this fantasy you're constructing where we're all one happy family under your control is never going to happen, because I would rather struggle and sacrifice and work 3 jobs than allow you to have this kind of power over us." He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him processing my words, could see the calculation happening behind those dark eyes, and then he did something that was somehow more terrifying than any explicit threat could have been. He simply smiled, a cold, controlled smile that suggested he found my resistance somehow charming or perhaps entertaining, like a child playing with dolls and pretending that they had agency when in fact their every movement was determined by the hand that controlled them. "You don't have a choice," he said, and the gentleness in his voice made the words even more devastating, because it suggested that he wasn't saying this with anger or malice, but simply as a statement of observable reality, a fact that I needed to accept the same way I needed to accept that gravity existed and that water was wet. "You have no money, you have no job, you have no apartment anymore because I had someone retrieve all of your belongings from that place 2 days ago, and you have a newborn daughter who requires constant care and monitoring and resources that you have absolutely no ability to provide." He stepped closer to where I was sitting, my daughter in my arms, and he looked down at us with an expression that was almost tender if it hadn't been so absolutely suffused with ownership. "You ran from me, Bella, and I let you run because I didn't know you were carrying my child, because you made sure I didn't know. But those days are over now, and you need to accept that the life you were trying to build is gone, that your choices going forward are no longer about what you want, but about what's best for her. Because I will fight you with every resource at my disposal to ensure that my daughter grows up in safety and comfort and with everything that she could possibly need or want." The implication beneath his words was crystal clear. He was using our daughter as leverage, was positioning his ability to provide for her as a counterweight to any resistance I might offer. And the absolute cruelty of that realization was that he was right, because I couldn't deny our daughter access to the kind of care and security that he could provide. I couldn't selfishly prioritize my own freedom over her welfare and her health and her future. And he had known that from the moment he walked into this hospital room, had understood that my maternal instinct would supersede any desire I had for independence or autonomy. "I'm not going to your penthouse," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I could hear the lack of conviction in them, could feel the foundation of my resistance crumbling beneath me like sand being washed away by an relentless tide. "There has to be another option. There has to be some way to do this where I'm not completely under your control, where I'm not basically your prisoner." He didn't respond with argument. Instead, he simply walked to the window of my hospital room and looked out at the city below, his silhouette illuminated by the afternoon light. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was imparting some kind of profound truth that I had been avoiding. "You've been my prisoner since the moment you decided to run from me," he said, "because the only reason you ran was that some part of you understood that you could never actually leave, that everything about who you are and everything about who I am means that we're bound to each other in ways that transcend conventional relationship dynamics. And the only difference now is that we're acknowledging that reality instead of pretending to operate under the illusion that separation was ever actually possible." When they discharged me from the hospital on the 4th day, I wasn't given a choice about where to go. A car was waiting downstairs, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows, and a driver who didn't speak or ask questions. And as I buckled my daughter into a car seat that was far more expensive and technologically advanced than anything I could have ever purchased, I felt something inside me break in a way that was irreparable. Felt the last shreds of my resistance and my hope for autonomy dissolve into a kind of resigned despair that was almost worse than active fighting would have been. The penthouse was exactly what I had feared it would be. A space of almost incomprehensible luxury. All floor-to-ceiling windows and marble and the kind of minimalist elegance that suggested that everything in this space had been selected with meticulous care and unlimited financial resources. And as Dante walked me through it, his hand never leaving the small of my back in a gesture that was ostensibly protective, but that felt more like a claim of possession, I understood that I had crossed some kind of threshold from which there was no return, that I had entered a phase of my life where my autonomy was officially and completely surrendered to his dominion. He had prepared a nursery that was perfect in every way. Soft lighting, climate control, a crib that cost more than my car, monitors that allowed him to watch our daughter from any room in the penthouse. And as I looked at it, I felt a surge of something that wasn't quite gratitude, because gratitude implied I had a choice, implied that his actions were generous rather than calculated. And instead what I felt was a combination of awe and despair at the sheer totality of his preparation. The meticulous way he had planned for our arrival, as if he had known all along that this moment was inevitable. "I want you to rest," he said that first night, as I stood in what was apparently our bedroom, one massive space with a bed that seemed to occupy an entire corner and windows that overlooked the entire city. And I realized with a sinking feeling that the bedroom had 2 doors, one from the hallway and one that connected directly to the nursery, which meant that even when I was attempting to sleep, even when I was attempting to have some small sanctuary of privacy, he would have complete access to me, would be able to come and go as he pleased, because our daughter would inevitably create a constant bridge between us that he could use whenever he wanted. I lay awake that entire first night, listening to the sounds of the penthouse, listening to the city humming below us, and I realized that I hadn't heard a single sound from Dante since he'd shown me to my room, which somehow felt more ominous than if he had been hovering, than if he had been enforcing his will through constant presence and constant assertion of control. Instead, his absence felt like a demonstration of his absolute confidence that I wasn't going anywhere, that resistance was futile, that I had already been so thoroughly claimed by him that he didn't need to continuously reassert his dominion, because the reality of it had already been established in ways that transcended the need for overt displays of power. When our daughter cried in the early hours of the morning, I got up to attend to her, and as I lifted her from her crib, I saw him standing in the doorway between our rooms, watching us with an expression that was indecipherable, but that somehow managed to communicate that every moment of my life from this point forward would be observed, catalogued, and ultimately controlled by his presence and his will. And in that moment, holding my newborn daughter in my arms while her father watched from the shadows of the connecting doorway, I finally understood the true depth of the price that I was paying for keeping this secret, for running, for believing that I could build a life separate from his. And I realized with a clarity that was almost blinding that the real game was only just beginning, that everything that had happened so far had been merely the opening moves of something far more complex and devastating, something that would require me to make choices that would fundamentally alter not just my life, but the life of our daughter in ways that I couldn't yet fully comprehend. And as Dante stepped into the nursery and reached out to touch our daughter's head with that same infinite tenderness that I had seen in the delivery room, I understood that the moment of true reckoning, the moment where I would have to confront the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, surrendering to him wasn't the most terrible option available to me, that maybe his darkness was something I could learn to live within, that maybe our daughter was safer in his arms than she had ever been anywhere else, was rapidly approaching, and I had absolutely no idea if I would have the strength to resist when it came. 2 weeks in the penthouse had transformed me into something I didn't quite recognize when I caught glimpses of myself in the endless mirrors that decorated Dante's world. A woman who had stopped fighting, a woman who had surrendered not because she had been defeated by force, but because she had been slowly, methodically shown that every alternative to surrender was infinitely more painful than simply accepting the reality of her circumstances, and the man who had orchestrated those circumstances with the precision of someone who had spent his entire life getting exactly what he wanted and had no intention of stopping now. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse one morning, holding our daughter against my chest while she slept, and I looked out at the city that sprawled beneath us, like a kingdom that belonged to him. And I realized that in the span of 14 days, Dante had managed to accomplish what I had desperately tried to prevent through 2 years of running and deception and sacrifice. He had made himself indispensable to both of us in ways that transcended mere provision of resources or demonstration of power. He had positioned himself as the only person capable of protecting us, of caring for us, of understanding the complexity of our needs in a way that I, in my fear and my isolation, had failed to do. Our daughter had a name now, Juliana, which he had chosen without asking my opinion, though when I heard him say it for the first time, his voice softening in a way that contradicted everything I knew about who he was and what he was capable of, I didn't object, because I understood that the name itself was an act of claiming, was him inscribing himself into her very identity, was him ensuring that even her name would carry the weight of his presence and his claim over her existence. I had watched him with her over these past 2 weeks, with a kind of morbid fascination, had observed the way his entire demeanor transformed when he held her, the way his dangerous edges seemed to soften just slightly but never entirely, the way his hands, which I knew had committed acts I didn't want to contemplate, moved across her tiny form with an infinite tenderness that made me question everything I thought I understood about the nature of violence and protection, and the kind of love that exists between a father and a child that has been born into a world of shadows and danger. He had hired a nanny, a stern, professional woman named Margot, who had worked for various wealthy families, and who clearly understood the particular requirements of working for someone like Dante Moretti, someone who demanded excellence and discretion in equal measure. But he had also insisted on being involved in every aspect of Juliana's care, had refused to delegate her feeding, or her bathing, or her nighttime care, had positioned himself as not just her father, but as her primary caregiver, in a way that suggested he was trying to build a bond with her that transcended biology and entered the realm of something almost spiritual. The turning point came on a night when Juliana had been crying inconsolably for hours, her tiny body racked with discomfort that the pediatricians couldn't quite pinpoint, her desperate wails echoing through the penthouse, while I found myself reaching a breaking point of exhaustion and despair, my hormones still raging from the pregnancy and the birth, my body still healing from the physical trauma of labor, and my mind fragmenting under the weight of understanding that I had absolutely no control over any aspect of my life anymore. I was standing in the nursery at 3 a.m, holding her while she screamed, and I felt something inside me crack in a way that was distinct from the previous breaks. Felt a kind of psychic collapse that suggested I was approaching some kind of absolute limit to what I could bear. And I remember thinking, with a clarity that was almost hallucinatory in its intensity, that maybe this was it. Maybe this was the moment where I simply ceased to exist as an autonomous being, and became nothing more than a vessel for her needs and his will, and the impossible circumstances that I had created by trying to escape him in the first place. Then Dante appeared in the doorway, completely dressed despite the hour, and he simply held out his arms, and I passed her to him because I had no energy left to resist, no will left to object. And I watched as he held her against his chest and began to walk, his movements slow and measured. And within minutes, her crying stopped, her body relaxing against him as if she had found in him some kind of security or comfort that I, in all my maternal effort and desperation, had been unable to provide. "You need to sleep," he said to me, not as a command, but as something that approximated genuine concern, and I looked at him holding our daughter, looking at the way his expression had completely transformed into something that suggested absolute devotion, and I felt something shift inside me. Not a surrender exactly, but more of a recognition. A dawning understanding that perhaps I had been operating under a false premise all along. Perhaps the choice I had been facing wasn't actually between freedom and captivity, but between two different forms of love. Two different ways of understanding what it meant to protect someone and be protected in return. I walked to the connected bedroom and lay down on the bed that still felt foreign to me despite 2 weeks of sleeping in it. And I listened to the sounds of Dante moving through the penthouse, singing to Juliana in Italian in a voice that was low and rough, but somehow achingly beautiful. And for the first time since I had run from him, I felt something approximating peace. Not because my circumstances had changed, not because I had suddenly gained autonomy or freedom, but because I had stopped fighting against the reality of what was happening, because I had surrendered to the fact that some bonds cannot be severed, some loves cannot be refused, and that sometimes protection looks like captivity when viewed from the outside but feels like home when you're finally inside it. When I woke the next morning, Dante was asleep in the chair next to the bed, Juliana cradled against his chest, and I sat there for a long time, simply observing them, observing the way his features softened in sleep, observing the way his arms protectively cradled our daughter, observing the man I had been running from and the child I had been trying to protect from him. And I understood with a kind of painful clarity that I had made an error in my judgment, that I had conflated darkness with cruelty in a way that wasn't entirely fair, that the man who had orchestrated my life and asserted his dominion over my future was also the man who would move mountains to protect our daughter, who would use every resource at his disposal to ensure her safety and comfort and future, and that perhaps love in his world operated according to a different set of rules than the rules I had been taught to follow. Perhaps possession and protection were so intertwined in his understanding that he couldn't conceive of one without the other. I reached out and touched his face gently, tracing the sharp line of his jaw, and his eyes opened immediately. Not in confusion, but with the kind of immediate awareness that suggested some part of him had been monitoring my presence even while he slept. And he looked at me with an expression that was so vulnerable and so exposing in its rawness that I felt my entire body respond with a rush of emotion that I had been trying to suppress for weeks, months, years. "I can't leave you," I said. And the words felt like a confession, felt like an admission of defeat, felt like a surrender of everything I had fought for. But they also felt like the most honest thing I had ever said to him, like the thing I should have understood from the moment he found me in that delivery room. I don't know if it's because of Juliana or because of what I feel for you, or because I've simply been broken down by the reality of your control, but I understand now that I can't build a life separate from you, that I don't actually want to, that somewhere along the way, between the hotel rooms and the secret meetings and the moment that I discovered I was pregnant, I became so completely entangled with you that any attempt at separation is just an illusion, is just me pretending that I ever actually had a choice about any of this. He didn't say anything in response to my confession, but he reached over and pulled me against him, his arm wrapping around me while he simultaneously maintained his protective hold on Juliana, and we lay there together in the early morning light, filtering through the massive windows, and I felt something inside me settle into place, felt the last of my resistance dissolve into a kind of acceptance that was both terrifying and oddly comforting. "I never wanted you to choose," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "I wanted you to understand that there was no choice to make, that you and Juliana are not things I'm choosing to possess. You're the only things in my entire existence that I'm choosing to protect, with absolute ferocity. And everything that I am, everything that I've built, Everything that I control exists for the purpose of keeping you both safe in a world that would absolutely consume you if I wasn't standing between you and it." The darkness in his voice when he said that last part was unmistakable, was the reminder that for all his tenderness with our daughter, and for all the softness he had shown me in these quiet morning hours, he was still the man who operated in shadows, who made decisions that had life and death consequences, who wielded power in ways that transcended conventional morality. And I understood that I was choosing to bind myself to him, not despite those things but in full knowledge of them, was choosing to accept the entirety of who he was, rather than continuing to pretend that some other version of him was possible. The weeks that followed seemed to exist in a kind of liminal space between my old life and this new reality. I stopped asking about leaving, stopped looking at windows as potential escape routes, stopped calculating how I might secretly contact old friends or rebuild some kind of independent existence. And instead I began to build something that approximated a life within the penthouse, began to understand the rhythms of his world and his expectations, began to accept my role as both the mother of his child and the woman who had somehow become essential to his existence, in a way that transcended simple possession or control. He took me to meet people who worked for him, carefully selected individuals who clearly understood the particular circumstances of my presence in his life, and who treated me with a kind of deference that suggested they understood that harming me or disrespecting me would result in consequences that they didn't want to contemplate. And I realized that in becoming his, I had also become protected by the vast network of his empire, had become someone worth protecting because I was connected to him. And there was a kind of dark safety in that understanding. Standing at the window of the penthouse one evening, watching the sun set over the city, while Dante worked in his study and Juliana slept peacefully in her nursery, I felt the weight of everything that had happened settle over me like a blanket, and I understood that my life had been irrevocably transformed by a single decision to hide a pregnancy, by a moment of fear and desperation that had led me to believe I could escape the pull of the one person who had fundamentally altered my capacity for love and autonomy and understanding of what it meant to belong to someone so completely that separation became not just impossible but undesirable. I had run from him thinking I was protecting our daughter from darkness, but what I had actually done was delay the inevitable moment when she would meet her father, when I would have to confront the reality of loving someone who existed in shadow and light simultaneously, when I would have to make peace with the fact that safety and freedom are not always compatible concepts, that sometimes the greatest act of love is surrendering your illusions about who you're supposed to be, and accepting the totality of who you actually are when stripped of pretense and defense. Dante appeared behind me, his hands settling on my waist with that familiar sense of possession that no longer felt threatening, but instead felt like the only kind of certainty I had ever known. And as he pulled me back against him, as I felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against my back, I understood that I had finally come home. Not to a place, but to a person, to a reality, to a truth that I had been running from, but that had been chasing me all along. And when I turned around and kissed him, when I felt his lips against mine with that same intensity that had first captivated me in a bar years ago, I realized that my daughter would grow up knowing her father, would grow up understanding that love and darkness are not mutually exclusive, would grow up understanding that sometimes the most powerful protection comes not from distance, but from absolute unflinching commitment. And as I surrendered completely to him in that moment, not as a defeat, but as a kind of transcendence, I finally understood what he had been trying to tell me all along, that I was never supposed to escape him, that we were bound by something far deeper than choice or circumstance, that we were intertwined in a way that only darkness can truly understand, and that perhaps the greatest love story isn't about choosing light over shadow, but about standing in the darkness together and finding that it's not quite as terrifying when you're not alone.